Welcome to Fright Nest, where the shadows come alive and every creak in the night hides a story waiting to be told. In this tale, reality blurs with nightmare, and by the end, you might find yourself questioning what's real and what's lurking just beyond your sight. Prepare yourself, because once you enter, there's no turning back. Now that the darkness has settled and the silence has grown heavy, it is time to dive into the story of the terrifying night. Prepare yourself, because this is where the ordinary turns into the unimaginable, and every step forward leads deeper into the unknown. Our story today is, once there was an exceptionally well-behaved 8-year-old boy named Miles. He did almost everything that good children are supposed to do. He ate all his vegetables except carrots. He completed all his school assignments, except for that one time he forgot to finish his homework. He was always nice to his friends, apart from that one time he yelled at his schoolmate, Tony. And he never talked back to his parents or got angry with them, except on very rare occasions. Yes, he was nearly perfect and a joy for his parents to raise, almost all the time. That boy existed more than 30 years ago, and in a way, he still exists. That boy is Miles, and he will always be a part of who he is. He remembers every transgression he made as a child, not only because there were so few, but because they ended up shaping his life in ways you could never imagine. Of all his misdeeds, the one that stands out most vividly is the very last time he yelled at his parents. The funny thing is, even though he remembers being mad and every word he said, he doesn't recall exactly why he was upset. When he tries to think of the reason, it's like looking at a blank sheet of paper in his mind. He can tell you that it wasn't anything his adult self would find consequential, but he knows it felt important at the time. It was 2 days before Christmas, and the words he spoke felt foreign as they came out of his mouth. Probably because he'd never said anything quite like it before. Go away. I don't want you to be here anymore. I don't want you to talk to me ever again. He could see the hurt in his parents' eyes as he unleashed his tirade towards them. Even now, he's surprised at what a profound effect the words from his 8-year-old self had on them. Their dismay was mixed with obvious shock upon hearing him lash out. His mother had a look on her face that was confused, sad, and angry all at the same time. His father was harder to read, but he knew he wasn't happy. Sadly, the looks on their faces are among the last memories he has of his parents. Their distraught scowls are burned in his mind, two visages that are now a permanent part of his psyche. By the time Christmas Eve came around, all had been forgiven. Whatever the issue had been, it was resolved. His mother cooked a special ham dinner, and they had a roaring fire going. The house was warm and extra comfortable, and in the hours after dinner, he sat and sipped from a mug of hot cocoa with peppermint. He no longer believed in Santa Claus, but that didn't stop him from feeling a natural Yuletide excitement. He fell asleep that night, staring at the dazzling lights and shiny ornaments that clung to their Christmas tree. He vaguely remembered his father carrying him to his bedroom and giving him a little kiss on his forehead. Miles awoke later that night to the feeling of someone poking their finger into his back. "Wake up, kid." It was a voice he'd never heard before, a man's voice with a slight drawl. His eyes opened widely as he instinctively rolled out of bed in an outright panic. He fell to the floor and screamed for his father. He was trapped in a corner of his bedroom. He could see the man's silhouetted figure looming clearly in front of him. A small red glow came from a cigarette in the man's hand. Miles froze in fear of this stranger who had invaded his home. The man spoke to Miles again. "Quiet down. He can't hear you right now anyhow." He put his cigarette to his lips and inhaled deeply. As he did, his face was illuminated by the red glow, and Miles could see his deep-set eyes, his dirty fingers, and his long black hair. "But kid, I can hear you. I can hear you better than anybody in ways you can't even understand." He pointed at the side of his forehead as he spoke. Miles didn't reply, but even through his fear, he couldn't help but wonder who the man was. The man nodded as if he knew exactly what Miles was thinking. "So, you'd like to know who I am? Well, I'm the guy who's tuned into your mind. I'm the guy that's been around for a long time. And most importantly, I'm the guy who gives kids what they ask for." He looked straight into Miles's eyes, invading his mind and reading his thoughts. "No, kid, I am not Santa." He was agitated. "You stupid? Do I really look like that fat fucker? No, man, I'm much better. I don't judge and I don't discriminate. I give kids what they ask for. The good kids and the bad kids." Miles finally found the courage to speak, even though the man seemed to have no trouble answering his questions before he even asked them. I didn't ask for anything." His voice trembled as he spoke. "Sure you did. You wanted your parents to go away. I heard that loud and clear. Loud and clear. Not very nice of you. I'd say that makes you a bad little boy. But don't worry. Like I said, I don't discriminate. But I don't want them to go away." The man shook his head. "You said it, you meant it at the time. I heard it. I don't hear all the kids, just some of them. And I hear you loudest of all." Tears began streaming down Miles's face, but their presence didn't seem to change the visitor's demeanor towards him. "Well, kid, I just wanted to meet you and see whose voice has been screaming in my head the past few days." He turned and started walking towards the door. "I gotta get started. It's time to give you your gift, and get a gift for myself too. Merry fucking Christmas, kid." He flicked his cigarette into the corner of Miles' bedroom as he passed through the doorway, repeating himself as he walked down the hallway in the direction of his parents' bedroom. "Merry fucking Christmas." The door to Miles' bedroom shut, even though the man himself had made no effort to close it. Miles screamed aloud for his mother and father. To this day, he still has no idea if they heard him. He wishes he could tell you that he bravely ran out of his bedroom to warn them, but he just sat huddled in the corner, crying and afraid. He listened intently for sounds of a struggle, or for his parents yelling, but he couldn't hear anything. Hours passed, and Miles could see the outside sky turn from black to gray, then to orange. He waited for his mother and father to find him. The orange sky turned blue as the day wore on, but they never came. An absolute silence hung over the house, yet still he sat there. It was well into the afternoon when he finally left his room. He knew he couldn't stay there forever. He tiptoed slowly to his door and opened it just a few inches. Looking out from inside his room, the house appeared normal. Everything that he could see was in its place. He pulled the door open all the way, almost expecting the man from the night before to jump out at him. But that didn't happen. Miles' voice broke the silence. "Mom? Dad?" No response. Trying his best to stay quiet, he walked slowly down the hallway towards his parents' bedroom. Their door was ajar. "Dad?" He put his hand on their door. "Mom?" He pushed it open and looked inside. He didn't actually remember what he saw. To be clear, Miles was perfectly aware of the fate that befell his parents, based on what was told to him later on. But he had no memory of the actual sight that he witnessed during that one awful moment. It was a traumatic event that his sane mind had blocked out. Even today, when he recreated the events of that night in his dreams, the scene faded to white as he pushed the door open. His next memory was of him laying down in the street directly outside of his house, screaming and flailing his arms wildly. The Porter family, who lived next door, witnessed his distress through their living room window. Mr. Porter exited his house and rushed over to Miles. He could tell something was seriously wrong. "They're dead." It was all Miles could say. He repeated it again and again. Mrs. Porter followed closely behind her husband and comforted Miles as he went to check inside the house. A minute later, he exited and promptly vomited in the bushes. Nobody ever told Miles the whole story of what they found in that bedroom, at least not directly. it was explained, I shook my head no. I clearly remembered the cigarette in his hand, and there was no glove. And he threw the cigarette on the ground when he was done smoking it? I nodded yes. And he closed your door when he left your room? I shook my head no, then thought about it, and nodded my head yes. I wasn't really sure. The detective took notes as I talked. He nodded his head pleasantly, but even then I could see the strange look on his face when I told him that the man had read my thoughts. The one thing I never told the police was that 2 days before the murders, I'd asked for my parents to be gone. The sketch artist came by afterwards. He started off by drawing some Smurfs for Miles. Then he slowly began working Miles up to the task of remembering what the murderer looked like. Miles appreciated his effort. When he was done, the picture looked somewhat like how Miles remembered the man, but not exactly. Miles was taken in by his mother's sister, Aunt Janine, and her husband, Uncle Anton. As unlucky as Miles had been with the deaths of his parents, he has to say that he was nearly as lucky to have those two in his life. Other than his parents, they were probably the best people in the world who he could have lived with. Looking back at the events in his life, he has to say that today he misses them every bit as much as he misses his parents. Janine worked as an office manager, but she took a leave of absence in the first few months after the murders so that she could be home to support him. Anton worked for a home security firm. He was the kind of man who always had a smile on his face, so much so that it would be impossible for a person to even imagine him angry. He made instant connections with people, and he had a confidence about him that made people want to seek his approval, whether consciously or unconsciously. Janine and Anton didn't have any children of their own, and they'd always been very generous towards Miles. He knew them well, so it was easy for him to slip into their lives. He put a huge effort into making sure that he gave them no trouble, and he asked them for nothing. His conversation with the murderer was never too far from his thoughts, and he could hear an amalgamation of the man's comments ring through his mind daily. I give kids what they ask for, the good kids and the bad kids. Miles didn't know what the good kids were given by this man, but he understood all too clearly what happened to the bad children. It was 2 months before Miles felt like he was ready to go back to school. Janine and Anton, and even the school administration, were very helpful and understanding throughout the whole process. His classmates welcomed him back with smiles and words of encouragement. It's often said that children can be cruel, but Miles thinks it's even more true that they can be sweet and supportive. He really can't emphasize enough how much returning to all his friends helped him along in the healing process. His anxiety began to ebb, and his therapist proclaimed that it was a major milestone for him. Despite the progress in his psychological healing, there were always several thoughts that Miles couldn't rid himself of. The first was the guilt that he felt about asking for his parents to go away. He knew full well that the murder of his parents was in no way his fault, but there was always that nagging voice that wouldn't let it drop. He'd asked for them to be taken away, and that's exactly what had happened. The second thought was that the murderer would return again the following Christmas. Initially, all the adults assured him that the man would be arrested quickly. Then, when that didn't happen, he was promised that there was no way the man could ever get his hands on him, and that he was safe. They made sure that he was never left alone, and when Janine went back to work, she only did so part-time so that she could pick him up when school let out. Miles also had difficulty with the more unbelievable aspects of what happened that night. He tried to convince himself, on a daily basis, that the murderer was just a normal man, and that his memory of those fantastical elements was merely his own imagination betraying him. But just like the guilt he felt, the troubling thought that this man was more than just a man didn't subside entirely. For victims of trauma, anniversaries can often trigger symptoms like depression and fear. For Miles, Christmas was the anniversary of his worst memory. As the summer ended, Janine and Anton, along with his therapist, decided early on that Christmas wouldn't be celebrated in their household that year. Nobody felt that Miles would be ready for it, and they were right. And they were right. Since they knew that Christmas was going to be an ordinary day for them, Janine and Anton made sure to throw Miles a huge birthday party in October of that year when he turned 9. It seemed like most of the community turned out. They had a bounce house, ponies, and even a magician. Everyone, including Miles, had a great day. It was probably the first time in 10 months that he'd grinned. Sure, there had been smiles up to that point, but he was referring to the type of grin where your teeth show and the elation on your face can't be mistaken. Unfortunately, the joy of his birthday couldn't last forever. Inevitably, the signs of Christmas slowly started popping up not long after Halloween passed, and Miles' anxiety started increasing. Though they weren't going to celebrate it, Christmas would be impossible to ignore. Holiday lights, store displays, television commercials, Yuletide songs pumped over public address systems. How can one avoid all those and still function within society? Though those harbingers couldn't be avoided altogether, Janine and Anton made a concerted effort to minimize his exposure. Instead of letting him watch his TV shows, Anton taught him the game of chess, which they played nightly. For the most part, they avoided taking him to any stores and kept him home or close by as much as possible. Avoiding these triggers probably helped somewhat, but Miles still couldn't get rid of the tightening feeling in his chest that he felt every morning when he woke up. Miles managed to avoid any sort of breakdown until the 21st of December. Aunt Janine, because she was taking care of him, had herself been staying home an inordinate amount of time. Finally, after their 5th game of rummy in a row, she'd had enough. She tossed her cards aside. "You know what, Miles? We've been cooped up too long. Let's get out of here. We'll go get some ice cream. One little trip out won't hurt, right?" Miles smiled in response. "Okay." Ice cream sounded good, even in the middle of December. Aunt Janine, who was talkative by nature, kept the conversation flowing all the way to the ice cream shop. This was her attempt to keep his focus away from the lights and displays that they passed, and it worked too. Ask a kid questions about his favorite superheroes, and he's going to be fairly preoccupied while he talks about them, even the quiet ones. They made it into the shop. Miles ordered a double scoop of chocolate fudge brownie. They sat down to eat their treats, with Aunt Janine still engaging him in conversation. Just for a brief moment, a nearby toy store's glittering Christmas display caught his eye through the window. They had a life-size poster plastered in their display window. It was a picture of Santa upon a rooftop, posed in a position as if he were just about ready to climb down a chimney. Blazing Christmas lights surrounded the display, and large words spelled out, "What do you want for Christmas?" Miles tried to turn away, but the colorful lights clouded his vision, enlarging in their scope until they all combined, finally creating a great white light. "Miles? Miles?" His aunt's voice was becoming more and more urgent. He suddenly realized she'd been calling his name for several moments. The cup of ice cream dropped from his hand. I just want them back." At that moment, the tears flowed freely. He could think of nothing else. He was hysterical. Aunt Janine quickly came over to his side of the table. "Oh my God, Miles, I'm so sorry." She grabbed him and hugged him tightly. He reciprocated, holding on to her as firmly as he could. "This was a bad idea. I'm so sorry, sweetie. I'm sorry I brought you out. That was stupid of me. I'm so sorry. I miss them too." It took at least 15 minutes for Aunt Janine to calm Miles to a point where they could leave the shop. They left their unfinished ice creams behind. No other incidents happened in the next couple of days, and Miles' interactions with Anton and Janine helped distract him. Finally, it was Christmas Eve. He was quiet all day long, even more so than usual. Anton noticed and had a talk with him after dinner. "You okay, buddy?" Miles nodded his head yes. Despite Miles' assurance that he was okay, Anton could tell he wasn't. He knew almost exactly what was on his mind. "Come here, Miles. Let me show you a few things." Miles followed Anton to the living room window where he moved the curtains aside. "See these windows?" He slapped his hand on the pane to show him how solid it was. "This is the strongest window that they make for residences. My company installed these. They're unbreakable, and there's no way someone can open them from the outside." Miles stared at the window, while on the other side, blackness enveloped the house. Anton took him over to the door. "See how strong this is? It would take a tank to knock this door down. The back door too. And there's no other way in." He led Miles over to the alarm control panel that was on the wall. "This is the best system that they make. I installed it myself." He kneeled down to Miles's level. "Miles, you're safe here. Nobody, and I mean nobody, can get in here unless we let them in." He glanced to the side with his eyes. "And don't tell your aunt I showed you this." He moved his coat aside so that Miles could see the holstered pistol he was wearing. "Just some added protection, but I won't even need this." Miles nodded, feeling a little bit safer, but not completely. He's still worried, not only for himself, but for Janine and Anton as well. Bedtime approached, and Aunt Janine, with an insight usually reserved for longtime mothers, knew the one thing that might make the night a little easier for him. "Miles, do you want to sleep in our room tonight?" she asked. "Yes." Miles smiled and nodded at the invitation. They would all be able to look out for each other. They'd protect him, and he'd be able to warn them if someone came in. They put some soft blankets on the ground for him, right next to their bed. It was in a nice protected spot in the large gap between the bed and the wall. Miles couldn't fall asleep for several hours, but he could hear both Janine and Anton begin their nightly slumbers. Their breathing became rhythmic and almost melodic. He listened intently for any noises that might have been out of the ordinary, but nothing abnormal sounded out. There was a clock ticking somewhere in the house, and the occasional car passed by outside. Finally, his wariness overpowered his uneasiness, and he began his night's sleep. The dream Miles had that night was unlike any other he'd had before. He was in what appeared to be a large garage, the type where mechanics worked on cars. All around him, automotive parts were spread out along the ground, tires were stacked up, and an old rusted chassis filled the center of the room. Grime dripped from walls. The area was lit by a single overhead lamp. He instantly knew he was dreaming, even though it was the first time he'd experienced a lucid dream. From the corner of the garage, he heard metal clanging. He turned around to face the sound, and out of the darkness, the man who'd taken the lives of his parents emerged. The man spit some phlegm onto the ground and wiped his mouth before addressing Miles. "Hey kid, don't worry. I ain't gonna hurt you. I'd like to though. I'd really like to be able to shut you up, but it don't work that way." Despite his grimy surroundings, and perhaps because it was just a dream, this didn't feel like a place of anger and fear. Unlike the year before, Miles was able to find his voice right away. "Why do you want to shut me up? I hardly ever even speak." When you consider some of the other obvious questions, it may sound strange that Miles chose to open with that. Who was this man? And why did he take interest in Miles? Those were the questions he was really thinking, but his participation in the dream was guided as if his actions weren't wholly his own. The man finally responded. "Hell, you quiet ones are the loudest of all. Y'all never stop thinking. Thought after thought. You kids can't ever just shut your brains off. Gamma just one loudmouth. Those kids never think about anything." Tell Miles's fear of the man, which had been otherwise controlled to this point, slowly began creeping back. The man saw the look of despair spread across Miles's face. "Have you been a good boy this year?" He gave a little chuckle. "Actually, yes, you have been. Do you remember what I said last time? I give kids what they ask for, the good ones and the bad ones." Miles shook his head. "I didn't ask for anything." He spoke with a confidence that he didn't really feel. "Sure you did. You kids always ask for something. And don't you worry now, 'cause you're gonna get it." The room and the man began to fade away. "See you next year, kid. I get the feeling that you and I are going to be part of each other's lives for a long time." Those were the last words Miles heard. Pure whiteness consumed him, and then he slept peacefully. Miles' eyes opened. Outside the window he could see the gray sky that signaled the approaching dawn. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. He stayed fixed in his bed on the floor, listening for signs of life from his aunt and uncle. But he could only hear his own heartbeat. He wanted to sit up and look over to them, but he was afraid of what he'd find. The dream had felt so real, he wasn't sure what to think. He continued to listen. "Please," he whispered to himself, "let me hear them breathe." Several minutes passed. He still heard nothing. Tears began streaming down his face, and his pillow became wet. He knew deep inside that eventually he would have to look and see if they were okay. He couldn't lay on the floor all day, but his gut instinct told him that he didn't want to witness what was up there. Drawing upon his deepest strengths, he put his hands over his eyes and sat up. Slowly, he moved a single finger away from his teary eye. There was no blood, no gore. He pulled his hands fully away from his face. He could see Uncle Anton's chest clearly rise and fall. He was sleeping peacefully and very quietly. Aunt Janine turned in her sleep and mumbled a few nonsense words before resuming her silent rest. Miles smiled, then he laughed in relief. He could see no evidence that the man had been there. It was still early, but any sense of sleepiness had been pushed away by his earlier feeling of dread. He stood up and walked over to the mirrored closet door. He looked at his red eyes and wiped them dry, while behind him he could see the reflection of his aunt and uncle sleeping soundly. There was no need to wake them. Miles left the room with the intent of getting something to eat, most likely a bowl of cereal. He walked down the hallway and passed by the alarm panel on the wall. All the lights were green. The doors, the windows, they were all secure. Nobody could have gotten in. Now fully relaxed, Miles passed through the living room on his way to the dining area. That's when he saw it, sitting right on top of the dining room table. He froze in place and looked all around to see if there was anything else out of place, but everything else was as it should have been. He turned again to the table and stared at the beautifully wrapped gift box that definitely hadn't been there the night before. It was a large box, maybe about 18 inches square. The wrapping paper that covered it was bright red, with sparkles all over it. A pretty green bow covered the top. His aunt and uncle had agreed that they wouldn't be celebrating Christmas that year. Yet there sat a gift box atop the dining room table. Miles wondered if they'd changed their minds. He walked slowly towards the gift, step by step. He stood up on one of the dining room chairs so that he could see the top of the gift. Whoever had wrapped it had taken their time. The box's lid was wrapped separately from the box itself. He lifted it up, then he peered inside. There was no fade to white for Miles that time. No, he saw exactly what was in the box, and simultaneously, 3 truths occurred to him. The first truth was that the man had been in his house. Despite all the security measures, he'd gotten in and out without raising a single alarm. The second truth was that the man had been right. Miles had asked for something without even realizing it. The third truth was the sinking acceptance that his visits would, "You've survived, for now. But beware, Frightness never sleeps. The horrors here will haunt you long after the video ends. So when you're ready for more nightmares, return to the nest. If you dare, we'll be waiting in the dark."